October, northern France. A field turned to mud by 3 days of relentless rain. 6,000 knights in full armor stand facing a broken, starving, disease-ridden army of 2,500 men. The French are waiting for the signal. They already see themselves as victors. They are already dividing the ransom money for English prisoners. They do not yet know that within 3 hours, most of them will be lying dead in the mud. Not from swords, not from cannons, from arrows, and from their own pride. This is not a legend. This is not a movie. This happened on the 25th of October, 1415, and it remains one of the most catastrophic military defeats in the history of European knighthood. Agincourt, a name French aristocrats would in shame for 200 years. Henry V was not supposed to be here. His campaign in France had started with ambition and ended in disaster. He had captured the port of Harfleur after a brutal 5-week siege, but the victory came at a devastating cost. Dysentery tore through his army like wildfire. Thousands of soldiers were dead or too sick to march. The men who remained were gaunt, exhausted, and running out of food. The original plan was simple: march to Calais, board the ships, go home. A 5-day journey, a tactical retreat disguised as a victory lap. It took them 16 days. The French had destroyed every bridge. They poisoned wells. They shadowed the English column from a distance, cutting off foraging parties, picking off stragglers. By the time Henry's army reached the village of Agincourt, his men had not eaten properly in over 2 weeks. Many were marching barefoot. Most were suffering from severe dysentery, so severe that soldiers had cut out the seats of their trousers just to keep moving without stopping. And now, blocking the road to Calais, stood the flower of French chivalry. The Constable of France, Charles d'Albret, commanded an army that outnumbered the English by at least 6 to 1. Some chronicles put the French numbers as high as 36,000. Modern historians settle closer to 12,000, but even the conservative estimate was overwhelming. The French had knights, crossbowmen, men-at-arms, and the full weight of the most powerful military aristocracy in Europe. Henry had archers, hungry, sick, desperate archers. The night before the battle, the French camp was loud with feasting and gambling. Knights were literally rolling dice to decide which English prisoners they would claim. They were so confident of victory that noblemen were arguing about who would get the honor of capturing Henry himself. In the English camp, there was silence. Men prayed. Men wrote letters they knew might never be delivered. Henry walked among his troops in the dark, speaking quietly to small groups of soldiers, learning their names. He knew what losing meant. No negotiated surrender, no honorable captivity. His army was too small and too weak to be worth ransoming. If the French won, the English would be slaughtered where they stood. Everything, the crown, the campaign, the lives of every man behind him, would be decided on that field the next morning. Dawn broke gray and cold over the fields near Agincourt. Henry surveyed the battlefield with the eye of a man who had studied war since childhood. What he saw gave him something unexpected: hope. The field between the two armies was narrow. Flanked on both sides by dense woodland, it funneled any advancing force into a killing corridor no wider than a few hundred meters. The French outnumbered him 6 to 1, but on this ground, they could not use that advantage. They could not sweep around his flanks. They could not encircle him. They had to come straight at him. And the ground itself was his greatest ally. 3 days of October rain had turned the freshly plowed field into something close to quicksand. The soil was soft, waterlogged, and deep. A man on foot would sink to his ankles with every step. A man in full plate armor, weighing close to 30 additional kilograms, would sink even deeper. Henry positioned his archers in a wedge formation along the tree lines on both flanks. Each archer carried a sharpened wooden stake, which they drove into the ground at an angle in front of them. A simple, brutal anti-cavalry defense that would transform the field into a killing ground. In the French camp, the commanders were arguing. This was not a small disagreement. This was a furious, ego-driven collapse of military discipline. The French nobility could not agree on who would stand in the front line, because standing in the front line meant the glory of capturing the English king. Every great lord wanted that honor. Nobody wanted to be assigned to the flanks or the rear. The crossbowmen, the most effective ranged weapons the French possessed, were pushed to the back, behind the cavalry, behind the men-at-arms, behind thousands of armored knights whose pride refused to let common soldiers stand ahead of them. It was a decision that would cost France everything. For 3 hours, neither army moved. Henry needed the French to advance. On open ground, his archers were devastating. But if the French simply waited, starved the English out, and forced them to attack uphill against a fresh and rested army, the result would be a massacre in the opposite direction. So Henry made a decision that seemed like madness. He ordered his entire army to advance toward the French lines. His men pulled up their defensive stakes, carried them forward, replanted them closer to the enemy, and then stood there. A tiny force that had just walked into range of one of the largest armies in Europe, and waited. The French took the bait. The French cavalry charged first. Hundreds of mounted knights thundered across the field toward the English archers on the flanks. It must have been a terrifying sight. The ground shook. The noise was immense. These were the finest war horses in Europe, ridden by men who had trained for mounted combat their entire lives. They never reached the archers. The English longbowmen released at a rate of 10 to 12 arrows per minute. Each archer, every archer on that field. The mathematics were brutal. Within the first 60 seconds of the charge, thousands of arrows filled the air simultaneously. Horses are not armored like knights. Arrows tore into their necks, their legs, their faces. Horses screamed and reared and collapsed. Riders were thrown. Some horses turned and bolted back the way they came, directly into the advancing columns of French infantry behind them, throwing their formations into chaos. The surviving cavalry that did reach the English lines crashed directly into the sharpened stakes. Horses were impaled. More riders were thrown. The knights who survived the impact found themselves on foot in enemy territory, surrounded. Now the French infantry began their advance. 10,000 men in heavy plate armor started walking across a waterlogged, plowed field toward the English line. The distance was perhaps 300 meters. Under normal conditions, a brisk walk. On that ground, on that day, it became an ordeal. With every step, boots and armored feet sank into the mud. Men stumbled, men fell. A knight in full plate armor who fell in that mud could not stand up unassisted. The armor was too heavy, the footing too treacherous. Some men drowned in the mud before a single English weapon touched them. The French formation, packed tightly together because of the narrow field, compressed further as men tried to avoid falling. They bunched into a dense, slow-moving mass. They could barely raise their arms. They could barely breathe inside their visors. And the entire time they were walking, the arrows kept falling. An English longbow arrow, released at close range, could penetrate plate armor at the joints, could pierce visors, could punch through the gaps at the neck, the armpits, the backs of knees. The archers were not aiming for the chest. They were aiming for every weakness in the steel. By the time the French vanguard reached the English men-at-arms, they were already broken, exhausted from the walk, thinned by arrows, compressed into a mass so tight that many men could not even swing their weapons. The English line held. The French vanguard collapsed. The second wave stalled. The third wave never properly formed. But Henry's problems were not over. Behind his lines, the English had accumulated an enormous number of French prisoners. Knights captured in the chaos of the initial fighting, men who had surrendered expecting the traditional rules of chivalric warfare. You surrender, you pay ransom, you go home. Then a messenger arrived. A French force, the Count of Marle, commanding troops who had not yet engaged, was reportedly moving to attack the English baggage train from the rear. Simultaneously, Henry looked at the battlefield and saw that the second French wave was preparing to push forward again. He was caught between two threats, with an army already at the edge of its limits. Henry made the most controversial decision of his military career. He ordered the execution of the French prisoners. His own knights refused. Killing a captured nobleman was not just murder, it was the destruction of the ransom income they had fought all day to earn. It violated every code of chivalric conduct. Henry's knights looked at their king and said, "No." Henry did not argue. He assigned the task to 200 archers instead. The prisoners were killed. The historical debate over this decision has never fully been resolved. Was the threat from the baggage train real or exaggerated? Was Henry's fear of a renewed assault genuine? Was this cold military calculation or something darker? What is not debated is what happened next. The French second wave, seeing what was occurring, lost its nerve entirely. The attack did not come. The baggage train assault turned out to be a minor raid by local peasants, not a coordinated military strike. Henry had ordered mass executions in response to a threat that effectively did not exist. The fighting was over in less than 3 hours. 3 hours. That was all it took to destroy the most powerful noble army in France. The Herald of France walked onto the field and approached Henry. Protocol demanded it. Someone had to officially declare the battle finished, had to give it a name. Henry asked the herald the name of the nearest castle. Agincourt, the man said. Then this shall be called the Battle of Agincourt. Henry walked the field himself. What he saw was beyond anything even a veteran of medieval warfare could easily absorb. The mud was not just mud anymore. It was a surface of bodies, packed so densely in places that you could not see the ground beneath them. French knights, men whose names filled the genealogies of the greatest families in Europe, lay face down in the soil they had been certain they would conquer. The Constable of France, Charles d'Albret, was dead. The Duke of Alençon was dead. The Duke of Brabant was dead. The Duke of Bar was dead. 3 of France's most powerful territorial lords gone in a single morning. More than 1,500 French noblemen and knights killed. Some estimates ran higher. The exact number has never been established with certainty, but the chronicles agree on one thing. France lost an entire generation of its military leadership in a single field on a single morning. The English losses were staggering in a different sense. Staggering because of how few there were. Henry lost somewhere between 100 and 500 men, depending on which source you trust. Modern historians generally accept a figure closer to 112 killed. In an army of 2,500 against a force of 12,000. Read that again. 100 men against 12,000. The numbers do not make sense until you understand the field, until you understand the mud, until you understand what happens when pride overrides tactics, when aristocratic ego dismantles military strategy, when 10,000 men in heavy armor try to walk across a plowed field in October rain toward men who can release 12 arrows per minute. Henry gathered his surviving troops. Many of them were still sick, still barefoot, still hollow-eyed from weeks of dysentery and starvation. They stood on a field covered in the dead of the most powerful army on the continent and tried to understand what had just happened to them. A chaplain who was present that day recorded Henry's words to his men. Henry told them this victory was not theirs. He told them God had delivered it. He forbade any boasting. He forbade any soldier from claiming personal credit for what had occurred. Whether that was genuine humility or political calculation, nobody can say with certainty. What history recorded was the image. A king, gaunt and mud-splattered, standing among his starving soldiers on a field of impossible victory, ordering them not to celebrate. The march to Calais resumed the next morning. Henry arrived in England to celebrations that shook London. The city lined the streets. Poets wrote verses. The church declared it a miracle. Parliament granted him new taxes for the continuation of the war. But in France, in the great houses and the provincial estates, in the castles and the cathedrals, there was a different kind of reckoning happening. Fathers were learning their sons were dead. Wives were learning their husbands had drowned in mud. The letters came slowly, over days and weeks, and each one dismantled another family, another bloodline, another centuries-old dynasty. France had not just lost a battle. France had lost the men who were supposed to lead it for the next 30 years. Agincourt did not end the war. It was supposed to. That was the point. A victory so overwhelming, so humiliating, so complete that France would have no choice but to negotiate. Instead, the war continued for another 38 years. France eventually won it. England eventually lost everything it had gained. The Treaty of Troyes, which made Henry heir to the French throne, collapsed when Henry died at 35 from dysentery, the same disease that had nearly destroyed his army before the battle even began. History has a brutal sense of irony. But here is what Agincourt actually changed, permanently and without reversal. It killed the idea of the knight. Not immediately, not in a single moment, but the image of the armored nobleman as the supreme force on the battlefield, The image that had defined European warfare for 300 years cracked at Agincourt and never fully recovered. What defeated French chivalry that day was not superior courage or superior numbers or superior technology. It was a narrow field, 3 days of rain, freshly plowed soil, and men with wooden bows who earned threepence a day. The knight was not invincible. He never had been. Agincourt simply made that impossible to ignore. The French knights who died in that mud had done everything right by the standards of their world. They had the numbers. They had the armor. They had the horses, the training, the bloodlines, the divine right of the nobility to dominate the battlefield. They had followed every rule that centuries of chivalric tradition had handed them. The rules were wrong. And there is something in that which reaches across 600 years and lands directly in the present. Every system, every institution, every set of rules that has governed human affairs for long enough eventually mistakes tradition for truth. Eventually confuses the way things have always been done with the way things must be done. Eventually sends its finest and most confident men marching in heavy armor across a muddy field into a wall of arrows, certain of victory until the moment the ground swallows them whole. Agincourt was not just a battle. It was a mirror. And what it reflected was not England's genius. It was France's inability to see the world as it actually was, rather than as it was supposed to be. The mud did not care about bloodlines. The arrows did not care about honor. The field did not care that these men had been told their entire lives that they were born to win. Somewhere in northern France, in a village that most people cannot find on a map, there is a field that looks like any other field. Green in spring, brown in autumn, quiet. 600 years ago, on a gray October morning, that field ended an era. It did it in less than 3 hours. This is day 4. If you want to know what happened when the Swiss pikemen shattered the Burgundian cavalry at Grandson, or how a single night assault changed the outcome of an entire war, subscribe. Because the stories that textbooks skip are always the ones worth knowing.